Welcome in the Geopolitical Situation Room. My name is David Criekemans. Today is the 16th of October 2019. This is our second video on the crisis in Northern Syria. As you know, a week ago, the American President Donald Trump, seen here a few hours ago in his meeting with the Italian President in the Oval Office in the White House, well, Trump made a decision to withdraw the remaining American troops in Northern Syria. And this caused the Turkish president to invade, if we can use that word, to invade Northern Syria. This was the situation a week ago, the 8th of October, the creation of a so-called security zone of 30 kilometers in the northern part of Syria by Turkish forces. As you know, last week there were also, of course, this region which is called Rojava was controlled by the Syrian Democratic Forces, which was more or less an American creation, mostly based upon the Kurdish fighters to fight against ISIS. But they had controlled, thanks to American power, this region east to the Euphrates River. Last week we also had the Syrian army of Assad, which was mostly fighting in the west, as you see, in the province of Idlib, together with the Russian Federation. Now, of course, we also need to take into account that ISIS was not completely gone. There were still pockets of ISIS in this region. What is the situation today, the 16th of October? Well, Turkey is trying to create that so-called security zone, but mostly it's concentrated in the center of the north. Meanwhile, there has been, very interestingly, an alliance between the Syrian Democratic Forces and the government forces of Assad. They now work together. So the Kurds feel alone because they were left alone by the Americans. Now they work together. You see that the Syrian army has moved into Kamishli. It has moved into the region of Manbij. And there are indications it is also moving in the center of the country. Meanwhile, there are the so-called Turkish forces, the Syrian National Army, as they call themselves, which are pro-Turkish groups, which are doing the heavy fighting together with the regular Turkish army. So they try to work together, apparently, and there have been heavy clashes with the SDF, mostly also in this region over there. And then we see there are ISIS camps. Al-Hol is one of them, but there are also others. Camps that have been attacked directly or indirectly, and there are indications that around 800 fighters, more or less, are free. There might also be former ISIS women among them. We don't really know. So the situation is extremely chaotic. Meanwhile, we see the Russian Federation moving into the power vacuum which was left by the Americans. So that's a new development, and the Russian Federation is becoming much more important. Of course, as you know from last week's video, I am promoting the website Syria Live View a Map because it gives us a good indication of what is actually going on in the region, and here is that map. So let's look at the same situation, but now in a much more detailed way. If we look to the west, we see now that the Syrian forces have indeed almost completely controlled the region of Manbij. They are driving up north, as you see, and they are also entering the region of Kobane. Meanwhile, very interestingly, we see over here the Russian convoys turning right, turning to the east over the Euphrates River, and possibly trying to maneuver into this region, because of course you see over here that there is intense fighting going on. Meanwhile, the Americans are completely leaving their camp. The Russians have already moved into that region. And then we see the heavy fighting in Tal Abyad, one of the regions where and there is now resistance. And also we see that the Turks have moved in. They're going not further than the M4 highway, which is crucial because it connects the west to the east. It connects all the cities. So if you control the M4, you can control more or less parts of the country. And here we see very heavy fighting between the SDF forces and the Turkish forces. Convoys were attacked, etc. Meanwhile, and also we must mention the heavy fighting over here in this region, which is, if we can look at it, Ras al-Naim. Then, if we go further to the east, we see that Assad is consolidating this region. And already on Sunday, there was that agreement between SDF and Assad's forces to enter into Kamishli, but the Turkish are still continuing with heavy bombing in the eastern part of the country, which is actually the core of the Syrian Kurdish people over there. So that's the current strategic situation. If we then move back to the diplomatic front, we see that the American president has now ordered his Secretary of State, Mike Pompeo, and his Vice President, Mike Pence, to go to Erdogan, to go to Ankara for negotiations. There is the American Senator, Lindsey Graham, who has said that he will organize sanctions from the US Congress, and he has a majority to do so. So as a response, but this is more internal politics of the United States, Trump has now raised the tariffs for Turkish steel from 25% to 50%. He has stopped the negotiations for a so-called free trade deal between Turkey and the United States, and he has evoked also certain sanctions on individual ministers of Erdogan, the Minister of Energy, Defense, etc. But it's a bit unclear what is going on here. Is he gonna mediate somehow? The bargaining chips of the United States are very little because it's no longer in the region. The real power broker in the region could very well be the Russian Federation. And of course, the Russian Federation will then need to balance its relations between Assad and Erdogan. But there are clearly opportunities. Now, if one studies this situation, we can go back to January 2019, and there we see already statements by the Russian Minister of Foreign Affairs, Lavrov, a career diplomat, well respected by everyone, who had already referred to the crisis of 1998, when indeed the Syrian territory was used or misused by Öcalan, the more Turkish-oriented Kurdish leader, who was actually a terrorist leader that organized terrorist attacks on the territory of Turkey. But he did it from Syria. And at that time, also Turkey threatened to invade Syria. And as a result of that, the so-called Adana Pact was created between Syria and Turkey. And Principle 1 states that Syria, on the basis of the principle of reciprocity, will not permit any activity that emanates from its territory aimed at jeopardizing the security and the stability of Turkey. So probably, since Lavrov had already said that the Adana Pact could be a good basis to create security in northern Syria once the Americans would leave, it's probable that the Russians will come up with a diplomatic solution which is quite close to this pact. Of course, then, what is important is that then the Syrian National Army should also, well, prosecute the PKK. But, well, now the SDF has just made an alliance with Assad. So that's going to be a very tricky situation. If that is indeed the case, then the SDF or some amongst the SDF may already have sent, well, signed their death certificates, or they might live another day and try to find another solution. Or the Russian Federation might come up with other solutions, such as a smaller security corridor of around 3 kilometers instead of 30 kilometers, or joint patrols between the Turkish and the Russians to create a kind of physical barrier between Turkey and Syria. Actually, the last weeks there were already 3 forms of joint patrols between the Russian Federation and Turkey along that border. We will follow up on this situation, and again, if there are new developments, we will let you know and we'll make a new video. See you soon. Thank you and bye.